Luke chapter 9. I think it's natural to want to be great at something. Nobody that wants to be a loser, or just insignificant. To be looked at as significant and outstanding among your peers, that's kind of a natural desire that we have. And even by worldly measures of greatness, many people sometimes want to be viewed as great or great at something, but don't want to put in the work or what it takes to be great. Think of that easily applies in the sports world, and you guys, I said it 50 times, but one of my favorite players is Kobe, and all the work he puts in outside when no cameras are on and not posting it on Instagram or anything like that, but he's doing the same thing over and over, not glamorous at all, but that type of commitment to practice and when nobody is seeing things allowed him to be one of the greatest. Even in the spheres of, let's say, music and piano, some of the greatest concert pianists or musicians are not just gifted talent-wise, they are, but they have put in the work hours and hours and hours. They're not being recorded and nobody sees, right? Some people want greatness so much that they would do anything it takes to be great. Right? You think of people, the cheating scandals that you see even in the sports world, right? And I remember back in the day there was the Patriots spied on people, and they didn't really have to do that, but they spied on the coaching signals and things of that nature in order to have a competitive advantage. It was like anything, whether it's ethical or not ethical, I'm going to do anything I can to be great and stand out. In the business world, you've seen people to climb the corporate ladder, cut other people off, do whatever they need to do to be viewed as great, to be the top dog in business, right? Whether it's unethical, whether it's illegal, right? Sometimes it might be, just because it's legal doesn't mean it's ethical, right? And people love to ride that line in order to be viewed as the greatest company or the greatest businessman, no matter what the case. This unfortunately happens in church life. I've been listening to a very sobering podcast that I would say use some discernment as you listen to it, because I don't necessarily agree with all the framing and some of the minor points in there, but it's called the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. I don't know if you're familiar with Mars Hill, but this is like a mega church in the 2000s, and it really into the early 2010s, mid 2010s. That was huge. With one man at the center named Mark Driscoll, and it's been very sobering to listen to for a lot of different reasons. But one of the things it teaches, that the one takeaway is that what happens when even Christian leaders are full of themselves, and it's all about their brand and them building their empire, right? And they're willing to do anything, even to other Christian brothers, in order to be looked at as great, and their ministry to be looked at as great. Many people in this world, in the Christian community, have their own ideas of what it means to be great. Many people steal and manipulate to be looked at as great. Many of us may have vain or short-sighted, sinful understanding of what it means to be great or how one becomes great. And we see that Jesus in this text paints an entirely different countercultural picture of what greatness looks like to God and how we achieve true greatness. Jesus, after letting the disciples know of his soon coming betrayal and being delivered up, starts, a series of teaching revolutionary gospel values that are not only in odds with the broader culture, but in odds with their own religious culture. And when I say series, Jesus in these next few passages are teaching these values, not in a sermon like we saw in Luke chapter 6, where there's a sermon and one of the emphasis is embracing gospel values and him teaching gospel values, but he's actually using the disciples' failures and wrong thinking and misplaced values as opportunities to teach them gospel kingdom values. Their behavior along the way produces a lesson series on Christ-like values and thinking out of each of these failures. So chapter 9 here, the next few texts, at least until 57 there, or 56, but also I would say that even the remainder of the chapter, we see Jesus offering a counterpoint to their viewpoint on what defines greatness, exposing the sin of exclusivity, exposing hot-tempered and judgment response to being rejected by people they considered their enemy, and teaching them about the cost of truly following him, right? We see a clear picture into the misplaced thinking and values and priorities of the disciples and a gospel counterpoint to that given by Jesus. And one of the larger points that we see, again, at least made until verse 56, we see that as followers of Jesus, we must embrace values and the mentality of Christ and not our own. As followers in Jesus, we must embrace the values and mentality of Christ, not our own. Embracing the values of a gospel community, not the values of the fallen world or even a fallen religious culture. And in our text today, specifically, we see that we must reject the prideful or worldly understanding of greatness and embrace what God calls true greatness. We must embrace Christ's understanding of true greatness. So let's read some of the text here. Look at verse 46. It says, an argument arose among them as to which one of them was the greatest. But Jesus, knowing the reasoning of their hearts, took a child and put him by his side. So other gospel accounts in Mark and Matthew kind of fill in the setting here, and it's, argument happened, I think, while they were on the way, but this actually happened in the house, and Jesus is not really there for the meat of the argument. He actually comes in after the fact, and, but he knows what they're talking about, not just what they're talking about, but what they're thinking. But in 46, we see the disciples here are in an argument, a very vain and prideful argument, and it's embarrassingly ironic because they were just shown to be limited in their power and understanding in the last passage. And also even more painfully ironic because Jesus earlier just talking about self-denial. In the last text, he's talking about his coming betrayal. And the disciples' focus is not on his coming sacrifice or their own self-denial, but on their own self-promotion. They're arguing about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. The recent failures and the sobering teaching of Jesus just mentioned did not stop them from having who was going to be the biggest and baddest in the kingdom conversation here. And again, they were not just having some light debate on who was the best fisherman, but a real argument on which one of them was the greatest. Can you imagine Jesus after teaching, right? And Jesus teaching all that he shared with them, he comes in and realizing, they're arguing about who would be the greatest. And you can just imagine this, this argument and, the inner circle disciples that we talked about that was on the Mount of Transfiguration. They're coming down here and they're saying, you guys couldn't even cast out this demon. If we were there, we could have taken care of it. Of course we're the greatest. Right? And they're like, Peter, shut up. The only reason they took you because, Jesus can't keep you by yourself for too long. You're going to mess up things. And Andrew's like, yeah, Peter, you wouldn't even know Jesus if I wouldn't have brought you. So clearly I'm the greatest. And they're going back and forth. Well, look what I've done. Look what I've done. And they're getting back and forth. And Jesus does not outright rebuke their actions, actually, and says, hey, what are you arguing about? This is petty. Your values are all messed up. Jesus actually takes a different approach to expose their folly and teach Christ-like value of what is true greatness. And verse 47 says he actually knew what they were thinking, the reasoning of their hearts. Jesus, being God at times under the Father's will, exercised as part of his deity that he would know the thoughts of people's hearts. And every time we see it actually mentioned, a teaching point comes. Every time that happens, he's teaching the disciples or the Pharisees something with that. So unlike us, when we see somebody's action, we can't be truly sure of what's in a person's heart. What was the real motivation? What was the root issue in that person's heartstrings that caused them to talk that way, to act this way? This is not the case with Jesus. He knows our hearts. He knows the real reasons and rationale of why we do what we do. why we say, why we value what we value, even if we're not even aware of our own motivations and influencing value system that motivates our behaviors and actions. And sometimes we're like, man, where does that come from? Christ knows, and his words and his spirit exposes those values and motivations if they are not aligned with his way. So the disciples here have a unique luxury and blessing of spending all this time around Jesus and following him. And yes, it exposes their failures, but the beauty and privilege was they got their values and thinking reset and reshaped by Christ himself. Jesus was there to help them learn from their failures and sin and disciple them into thinking like him, valuing what the Father valued, what he valued. So spending time with Jesus like disciples did and following everywhere gave them the opportunity to have their values and their thinking and behavior shaped by Jesus. And yes, often failure was the occasion for Christ's discipleship and value shaping. But it was a blessing that they had this opportunity. And you see that even if you read the epistles of Peter and John, you see how much Christ's teaching rubbed off on them. And this is not a major point of the text here, but a broader principle that we can glean here is that although none of us are physically following Jesus like the disciples, that would have been cool, right? But we have the Spirit of Christ in us. And as we walk with him in his word, meditating on what he says, praying for God, praying to God to search us, oh God, and see if there be any wicked way in us. And we're confessing sin, where we're shaping our attitudes and minds after the mind of Christ revealed in Scripture. What happens is Christ himself also corrects, resets, and changes our values, thinking, and priorities. You'll find, actually, that the more you are away from Jesus, away from prayer, meditation, personally and corporately worshiping Jesus, the more your thinking will not be aligned to the mind of Christ. You will still sin and fail, but instead of coming to Christ for forgiveness and Christ reshaping your thinking, you learning from your sin, right, and failures, you will just be continuing them. Being with Christ, walking closely with him, yes, listen, it will expose our sin. When we're walking with Christ, in fact, we become more sensitive to our sin, right? It will expose our sin and our wrong thinking, and it will be humbling at times. But it beautifully aligns our thinking to his ways. Our failures becomes lessons for future victory. Point here is walk with Jesus, right? Spiritually walk with Jesus. Let him reshape your thinking. Let him expose your sin and misplaced priorities and values to be aligned with gospel thinking in the gospel way. Disciples probably not have realized all this was going on, but that's what's going on here. But the text says, Jesus, knowing the reasoning of their hearts, took a little child by his side. Now, why do you do this? First of all, where did the child come from? Well, he's there in the house, so there's probably children around. He just grabbed one of them. And even though Mark, indicates that discussions happen on the after the debrief here, we see a child is used as a object lesson in this house. Now, what's the significance of receiving a little child in Christ's name? What was the point that Jesus was making? It would seem odd to me, and it would seem kind of odd. Well, a child in that culture was the least on the totem pole when it comes to power and significance. The child would represent the lowest in social status and significance. People actually did not take their concerns seriously when deciding what was good for the Roman Empire or even the Jewish way of life, right? Yes, they were definitely loved and adored, but not respected, and no power and their concerns were not taken seriously until they reached adulthood. In fact, I was reading in Hebrew culture, you have to be 12 before you're officially taught the Torah, the Old Testament scriptures there. And one of their authoritative Jewish writings, right, that they, acted like was, some acted like it was just authoritative as the Torah, was the Talmud. And basically it regarded spending time talking with children was a waste of time. Listen to this, one rabbi wrote this in there. Morning sleep, midday wine, chattering with children, and tarrying in places where men of the common people assemble. destroy a man. So Jesus spending time with children and just living a life among the common people, absolutely countercultural to what people thought was successful or a life worthy of meaning and significance, especially for a rabbi. This cultural norm or the perception of children is why the disciples, in another text, you guys know this, it's always taught the kids, right? Jesus is spending time with children and the disciples try to kick the children out, right? Jesus don't have time to be interacting with you kids. He has more important things to do. And Jesus has to rebuke and correct that mentality in that text. But that what they were doing is just acting out their broken cultural norms. The culture then, even to the disciples to some degree, thought greatness was in part about the company you keep and the power and the significant people you align yourself with. The child here is a visual example of the least in society, right? Embracing the least. So when Jesus says, whoever received this child in my name, he's not merely just talking about welcoming children, although that's certainly included. Jesus is using the child as a visual representation of all those in that society that were customarily ignored or at worst belittled and despised. This is an emphasis of Luke's gospel and something at the heart of Christ. One commentator says greatness is not merely the possession of those who associate with the great. Rather, it's the gift of God to those who receive and serve the lowly. True greatness, according to Jesus, in part involves embracing and valuing those who are insignificant, powerless, voiceless, those who are often overlooked, those who you won't get much fame, right, for embracing and serving. Those who maybe in your own religious culture, and maybe the culture as a whole ignores and treats as not as important. In that culture, it was lepers and tax collectors and women, unfortunately, and culturally accepted sinners, the poor. But who are those in our context? I mean, I think a lot of the same categories could apply, but it definitely could be the missionaries serving in remote countries, ministering the gospel to unreached, suffering people, loving their neighbor holistically, right? Sharing the gospel with them, getting them Bibles, translating those Bibles into their language and but also helping them in clinics and orphanages and food banks and starting schools. Again, not for social media clout or a resume boost for a future ministry position, but faithfully serving unreached and suffering people without trying to get fame or notice. Ministering ministering to people's physical and spiritual needs out of love for Christ and love for others. You know, I think of Amy Carmichael, who was an Irish missionary to India, giving the gospel to these children in India, and she's known for opening an orphanage after rescuing children from being trafficked in Hindu temples. Listen, she served, and I'm not necessarily endorsing this as like a missionary model for everybody, but she served in India for 45 years without a furlough. And then after that, the last 20 years of her life, she remained bedridden, and she just wrote several books about her missionary work and what still needs to be done. Now, we know about her then, but, many of those years, not people know exactly what she's doing, what she's giving up in order to serve these people and love these people for the sake of Christ. We often value preachers and Christian servants, just, whether in vocational ministry or not, with big ministries and blogs and books, and praise God for faithful preachers who God has blessed with that influence. But greatness is found in many of the small church pastor and even Christians who are not in vocational ministry but are faithfully serving Christ and his church in their communities in ways that will never be widely recognized. There are people in this country and in abroad who you and I will never hear about on this side of eternity. They're humbly and faithfully serving Christ. Might not have the same distinctions that we have theologically, but they are faithfully serving Christ, ministering to the least and outcast and unreached and neglected people of this world with little to no major recognition. God sees them and recognizes their humble labor of love, and that is truly great in his sight. You know, they won't be the Bible conference speakers, right, list, right? They won't have a huge social media following and books, but they embrace a life of humble service to the least of these. They love their neighbor and their society and love people who Christians in the world often ignore. Listen, it doesn't matter if the world notices. It matters if God notices. God sees their faithfulness and embracing a life of humility and service to the overlooked. That is part of true greatness. How about ministering, to a small church faithfully? I think of, my youth pastor, right? Wasn't paid very much, but just ministered to kind of a smaller church his whole life. Now he's doing something else, but that was like for years and years. Maybe choosing to serve and minister in a ministry that doesn't, and I'm not just talking about this ministry, maybe the Lord calls you to different places, but definitely includes a ministry maybe like this, but it might not have all the glitz and glamour and ministries that you want. May have some faults. But there are people there who need to be ministered to, who need to be supported. There are people in the community that are hurting that could use your gifts and your time and money to edify them and to encourage them and to show the love of Christ to them. Ministering to people like this includes ministering, in our context, includes ministering to people at low social status, zero money, the poor. People who cannot return the favor. Like you're not going to get some type of something in return from them. People who have hygiene issues, who are awkward, just awkward socially. Maybe the mentally handicapped. I was just talking to a friend of mine who has a mentally disabled child, and that's a much neglected ministry. People just say, well, I can't really witness to them, and they won't really understand. And it's almost like, you just be nice to them. But regardless of their mental state, people with mental disabilities are loved and cherished by God, and we can show the love and compassion of Christ to them. Ministering to people with critical backgrounds, the scars on this world that are on them, drug abusers or prostitutes. Not that this was they got saved from this 20 years ago and they're living for the Lord and you're ministering. So I'm talking about building relationships for the sake of the gospel and showing compassion to people who are struggling in that right now. Our society loves to call evil good and good evil. And one of the ways that they're doing that is they're starting to glorify what they call as, sex work, right? It's just like prostitution, getting paid for it, and it's legal. It's just like being an accountant. You shouldn't be shamed for that and stuff like that. And yes, we shouldn't shame, but that's a wicked lifestyle. But even though it's wicked, people caught up in that life of sin needs to be served and loved and shown the compassion of Jesus and given the gospel of Jesus. Not in a spirit of spiritual pride or sinful judgmentalism, but in the spirit of general love and compassion for them as broken image bearers that need to be restored in Christ. Are you willing to spend time with and minister and embrace people like that? Are all the people that you spend time with are people like you? Or people that don't make you get out your comfort zone? Do you have relationships with people who your job, school, or church would think have some issues? Hard to hang out with people who struggle with drunkenness. Who in your own family that has serious needs that people are your family is just neglected? It might be their own sin, but you're part of that group that haven't talked to them, that just neglected them. Are you putting yourself in situations and places and relationships with people that you can minister to that are often neglected, lowly estate, lives marked by sin, people in prison, the poor, the unkept, the mentally impaired, socially off-putting, children, your own children, no matter if nobody else sees, Part of greatness in God's eyes is selflessly ministering to people around you in your sphere of influence that maybe the religious culture and the broader culture ignores or doesn't see. All right, not for recognition, but out of love for them and love for Jesus. It's not about you trying to be great through self-promotion and comparison. But the path to greatness in the eyes of Jesus includes receiving those of humble estate, including children in his name. Also, greatness according to Jesus here involves how one is related to Jesus, right? Or the embrace of Jesus. When you embrace the least and overlook, you're actually embracing Jesus. And when you're embracing Jesus, you're embracing the Father. Jesus saying the only, you show that you're great by your relationship with me and the Father. And you want to embrace the Father, embrace me. And one of the ways that you show that you embrace me is by loving and embracing those who are often overlooked. That is what God cares about. God cares about ministering and embracing the least of these. Church, get this. If you are in right relationship with Jesus and the Father, it radically changes how you view other people. All people. You see them as Christ sees them, with dignity, worthy of value. No matter who they are and how they are accepted and embraced by society, you see them as loved, valued image bearers who need to be shown the love and embrace of Jesus. That's why Paul says in the text that Byron's talking about in Sunday school in Romans 12 says, associate with the lowly. This kind of clickiness and stuck-upness, I don't know if that's a word, spiritual pride in a gospel community has no place. We actually seek out those who are ignored and lowly, and it's an evidence of our relationship with Christ. Now, if you, after the sermon, everybody starts hanging out with you, people think you're lowly. No, just kidding. But hanging out with lowly and embracing the lowly does not come from a patronizing heart of, oh, look at me, having it all together, associating and embracing these lowlights. Hashtag Christ-like. No, it's realizing you are no better than them. And it's only by the grace of God you are in the situation that you're in, right? Anything that you know, any financial status or spiritual knowledge that you have is only by God's grace. And it's only by the grace of God that you are not in some worse situation that you might see and you jump back towards. And gospel community will view all people, especially overlooked people in society, with the eyes of Christ. Despite their sin, despite their awkwardness, despite their ailments, you see their dignity, worth as an image bearer that Christ died for. Then we see that Jesus drives the main point of this object lesson with this last statement here in this text. Look at 48, the end of 48. He says, for he who is least among you all is the one who is great. You want to be great? Be least. Be insignificant. Be humble. The problem was not necessarily the pursuit of greatness. The problem was what they thought greatness was and how they pursued greatness, right? Through vain and prideful comparison and self-promotion. The disciples think greatness is found by the company they keep, by comparing their external religious resumes, by trying to show the world, or their religious subculture that they're the greatest. Christ says, no, the one who is least is the one who is great. Wait, what? Christ is shattering and reversing common accepted values and norms and giving the gospel counterpoint. What does Christ mean by being the least? Being the least is not you just trying to be last place or something like that, because you're just trying to put on this false humility. I'm just not going to win anything. I'm not going to try my best. I need to be humble. I need to be last. That's obviously not what he's talking about. Being the least is being willing to humble yourself to serve, love, and sacrifice for others like Christ did. Jesus is not saying just because you serve in lowly places or to lowly people that you're automatically great. All right? Jesus' emphasis here is on the character of the person more than what he's doing. He who is least is great. You can actually minister to the least of these and with very sinful and prideful motivations, right? To be noticed, to build your resume. You know, some Western missions in the past have been done really in a colonization, building empire of people that look and act like them more than it has been loving and ministering to lost people as equals, as people that need to be the grace of God like they did. You know, trying to just emplace their culture instead of letting gospel culture impact their culture and not their own preferences. But the point is that Jesus is emphasizing is that being the least is a character quality, not just external actions. You know, some people have this attitude of being the least, have large ministries, right? And a large following. Jesus is not knocking them for that. We know, some of you guys know very humble, faithful ministers who happen to also have large followings, right? And they would be in view here. So what does it mean to be the least? It is a way in which you deny yourself, right? And follow Christ, embracing a life of humility. It's a rejection of pride and self-promotion and embracing a mindset of humility. As someone said, I don't know who said it, but I do like the quote, humility is not thinking less of yourself as much as it is thinking of yourself less. Not thinking you're better or greater than the next person. It's realizing you're a sinner saved by grace, and any gift or knowledge or service that you have is all by the grace of God. It's this mentality, this kind of the gospel least mentality manifests itself in serving others and putting others' needs before yours and serving people that you won't get recognized for serving. It's ministering in ministries in places that are hard, small, unknown, have flaws. In other gospel accounts, Jesus connects this attitude of being the least with being the servant of all as the gospel action that comes out from this mindset of being the least in this world. So in summary, there's like two main points that Jesus is teaching about the nature of greatness according to God's sight. And one negatively, greatness is found not in comparison and elevating yourself, right? Pride, even spiritual religious pride, is not the way to greatness in God's sight. Gospel ministry is not about your personal advancement or my personal advancement or others looking to you as great. As one commentator says, true ministry involves receiving such lowly types as well as recognizing that the least among them is great. How the world and religious subcultures talk about greatness is antithetical to how God views power and greatness. And drawing attention to yourself, even if you're talking about your spiritual resume, you have to realize that greatness is not found in you being impressive or impressing others with your religiosity. Greatness means decentering yourself, resisting pride, not wanting to just be motivated by being viewed as great among your religious peers. How your religious subculture views greatness in the world is not where you find greatness in the eyes of God. Greatness is not found in comparison and elevating yourself. But the second major point that I see that we see in this text here is, secondly, greatness according to Jesus is found in embracing humility and serving those of low estate. Low estate does not mean only those in society in which society or culture seems as lowly. We're supposed to be servants of all, but the point is that people run to meet the needs of the rich and powerful, right? In the book of James, people wanted the rich people and powerful people to sit at the good place, right? Has to be a lot of emphasis on serving people who are already served, right? It's the people without money, power, social respect, and intention that are awkward that we must make sure that we don't overlook. Church life is more about your concerns and promotions. It's more about you serving and loving others, even though you might not be recognized. People may never see you day to day discipling your children, right? And pointing them to Christ. But guess what? God sees it and it matters to God. People might not see you serving in a small church for your whole life, and even serving in ways that are not glamorous, right? That are not public. Maybe you're cleaning and you're doing the service in the kitchen or something else that, that people don't see. but God sees it. Let's live lives of humility and Christ-like service, because that is truly great in God's sight. Now, unfortunately, this is a lesson that really was not internalized by the disciples fully. After this lesson, in chapter 22, guess what's going on? They're arguing about the same thing, right? And Jesus has to go alongside them, making it more clear of how greatness is viewed in God's kingdom. And the reason I bring that up for us is nothing that I'm saying is necessarily new. I'm repeating a lot of the same things that you've heard. Much of the lesson and principles before you is not new, but many times we still let our values and thinkings be misplaced and wrong. We must constantly repent and remind ourselves of Christ's values and what's great in His eyes, until those values and priorities and attitudes are an integral part of our being, right, and behavior. This is a lifelong journey of growing in humility. I mean, we're so broken that even in the midst of our prayers, we're thinking, oh man, that sounded good. I wish I said that publicly, right? It's all in us, right? We need to grow in this. Every time we have a thought or attitude or response that is not aligned with the gospel way, with the mentality of Christ, we need to allow Christ to shape us, right? Decentering ourselves and center on Jesus and others. That is greatness. It's not self-promotion, but a life of growing in humility and humble service and promotion of Jesus and others. There is no greater example of true greatness than Jesus himself. Jesus embodied a life of true greatness, right? He ministered to people who it was shocking to minister to. He touched the lepers. He ministered with prostitutes and tax collectors and culturally accepted sinners, right? He also ministered to the rich and Pharisees and things of that nature, right? He shows an example of true greatness in how he died, right? Not only did he live a life of humility and service to all types of people, but he died a gruesome death, right? Was torn apart physically, and then spiritually he is separated from his Father. He is perfect, holy, holy, holy. That's who Jesus is. And he has all our sin on him, and he is separated from his Father. The Father has to turn his face away from Jesus on account of us. He was willing to be cast aside by his Father so we might brought into the family of light, in the family of God. Church, if you want to know what true greatness looks like, look at the life and death of Jesus. That is the blueprint. If you want to be great, don't look at the world's values. Don't try to look up to what your subculture thinks is great. Model the humility, love, and service of Jesus. Love sacrificially. Use your power and God-given privileges to help those who do not have that, right? Minister the gospel to people without needing the world to know it or expecting something in return. Love and serve people who can't return it back. Think about others and their needs more than your own. That is greatness in God's sight. As followers of Jesus, we must let Christ shape our values of what is true greatness, not ourselves or our culture. Let us, by the grace of God, seek to be a people who promote Christ and serve him and others, no matter who they are.